Welcome to this journey through one of the most enigmatic and haunting tales ever recorded in the blood-soaked history of the Arizona frontier. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and what hour of the day or night you're listening to this chronicle of betrayal and vengeance. We're fascinated to know how far across the world this story of the desert ghost reaches its restless spirit. In the scorching wasteland of 1880s Arizona territory, where the sun turned men mad and the desert claimed souls with ruthless indifference, there lived a legend that walked the knife's edge between hero and monster, between civilization and savagery. This is the documented account of the Apache Kid, a name that would echo through the canyons and arroyos of the Southwest long after the man himself had vanished into the realm of myth and shadow. Born somewhere in the early 1860s in the rugged mountains of what would become Arizona territory, the child who would become known as the Apache Kid entered a world already torn apart by violence and cultural collision. His Apache name, lost to history like so many fragments of his people's identity, was replaced by the white man's designation when he became a scout for the United States Army in 1881. But this simple transformation of name would prove to be only the beginning of a metamorphosis that would ultimately consume both the man and the legend. The Arizona Territory of the 1880s existed in a state of perpetual warfare. The Apache Wars, which had raged for decades, represented more than simple military conflict. They embodied the fundamental clash between two incompatible ways of life, two radically different relationships with the harsh beauty of the southwestern landscape. The Apache, masters of guerrilla warfare and intimate knowledge of every canyon, mesa, and water source, fought to preserve their ancestral homeland against an inexorable tide of miners, ranchers, and settlers who saw the same landscape as resources to be extracted and territory to be claimed. Into this maelstrom of violence stepped the young Apache who would become the Kid, a man caught between worlds in ways that would ultimately destroy his soul. Unlike many of his people who maintained unwavering hostility toward the encroaching Americans, the future Apache Kid made a choice that seemed pragmatic at the time but would prove catastrophic in its consequences. In 1881, at approximately 20 years of age, he enlisted as a scout with the United States Army, joining the ranks of Apache men who had chosen to serve the very forces that were systematically destroying their people's way of life. The decision to become an Army Scout was not uncommon among Apache men during this period, though it was always fraught with moral complexity and community tension. The U.S. military desperately needed guides who understood Apache tactics, knew the terrain intimately, and could predict the movements of hostile bands. For Apache men like the Kid, scouting offered regular pay, food, and a degree of protection for themselves and their families during a time when traditional sources of sustenance and security had been largely eliminated by military pressure and confinement to reservations. Lieutenant Britton Davis, who served as the Kid's commanding officer during much of his military career, provided detailed accounts of the young Apache's exceptional abilities and complex character. In reports filed with territorial military headquarters, Davis described the Kid as the finest scout I have ever commanded, possessing an almost supernatural ability to read sign, predict weather patterns, and navigate terrain that would challenge even experienced frontiersmen. Davis's official reports, preserved in the National Archives, reveal the depth of his respect for the Kid's military service. This Apache possesses intelligence that exceeds that of many commissioned officers, combined with physical capabilities that make him invaluable for reconnaissance and tracking operations. His loyalty to the United States Army has never been questioned, and his contributions to our campaign against hostile Apache bands have been essential to our success. The Kid's military service record, compiled from surviving Army documents, reveals a pattern of exceptional performance and growing responsibility. Between 1881 and 1887, he participated in numerous campaigns against Apache raiders, served as chief scout for several major operations, and was specifically commended for actions that resulted in the capture or killing of Apache warriors who had been terrorizing civilian settlements throughout the territory. Military correspondence from this period reveals that the Kid had become not simply a scout, but a strategic asset whose knowledge and abilities were considered irreplaceable. Colonel George Forsyth, commanding officer of military operations in the region, wrote in a confidential report dated June 1886, "The Apache Kid has proven himself to be far more than a tracker or guide. His understanding of Apache psychology and tactics has enabled us to anticipate and counter hostile movements with unprecedented success. He has single-handedly prevented numerous raids and ambushes that could have resulted in significant military and civilian casualties. But the Kid's exceptional military service contained within it the seeds of his eventual downfall. His effectiveness as a scout required him to hunt and kill members of his own people, creating psychological pressures that few men could sustain indefinitely. Moreover, his success made him a target for Apache warriors who viewed him as a traitor to his people and his culture, while simultaneously making him suspect among white military and civilian personnel who could never fully trust an Apache, regardless of his service record. The complex dynamics of the Kid's position became even more problematic due to his relationship with other Apache scouts and the broader Apache community confined to the San Carlos Reservation. San Carlos, established in 1871, was designed to concentrate diverse Apache bands on a single reservation where they could be monitored and controlled by federal authorities. The reservation system forced together Apache groups that had historically been enemies, creating internal tensions that were exacerbated by the presence of scouts who served the U.S. military. Contemporary accounts from reservation officials and military personnel reveal that the Kid occupied a uniquely precarious position within Apache society. Warrior bands that remained hostile viewed him as a collaborator whose actions directly contributed to their defeat and confinement. Apache civilians on the reservation respected his abilities, but questioned his loyalty to traditional Apache values and customs. Even other Apache scouts regarded him with mixture of admiration and suspicion, recognizing his superior skills while resenting his prominent position with military authorities. This social isolation was compounded by the Kid's personal characteristics, which set him apart from both Apache and white communities. Military records describe him as unusually intelligent and articulate, capable of communicating effectively in English, Spanish, and multiple Apache dialects. He was also noted for his physical capabilities, described as being of medium height but exceptionally strong and agile, with the kind of endurance that allowed him to travel incredible distances across desert terrain without apparent fatigue. Lieutenant Davis's personal journal, discovered in his family's archives in 1954, provides intimate insights into the Kid's personality and the psychological pressures he faced. The Kid possesses a mind that works with remarkable speed and precision, analyzing situations and developing solutions with an efficiency that would be admirable in any man. But there is something in his eyes, a darkness that seems to grow deeper with each campaign, each action that requires him to turn his skills against his own people. Davis's journal continues with observations that proved prophetic. "I fear that we are creating a man who will ultimately be destroyed by the contradictions of his position. He serves with absolute loyalty, but that service requires him to betray fundamental aspects of his identity and heritage. Such contradictions cannot be sustained indefinitely without consequences that may prove catastrophic for all involved." The breaking point came in May 1887, triggered by an incident that exemplified the impossible situation in which the Kid found himself. According to military reports and testimony from multiple witnesses, the Kid became involved in a violent confrontation with other Apache scouts that resulted in several deaths and ultimately led to his transformation from loyal soldier to hunted outlaw. The incident began with a traditional Apache dispute over the death of the Kid's father, who had been killed in what appeared to be a personal conflict with another Apache man named Rip. According to Apache custom, the death required vengeance from the victim's family, but military regulations prohibited such traditional justice among scouts serving the U.S. Army. The Kid faced an impossible choice between honoring his cultural obligations and maintaining his military service. On May 25, 1887, the Kid and several other Apache scouts, including his half-brother, confronted Rip and his supporters in what military reports described as an unauthorized action that violated direct orders. The confrontation escalated into violence that resulted in the deaths of Rip and at least 2 other Apache men, along with serious injuries to several others. Captain Francis Pierce, who commanded the Apache Scout Unit, filed a detailed report of the incident that reveals the complexity of the situation. The Apache Kid and his associates acted in direct violation of military orders and territorial law by pursuing personal vengeance against fellow scouts. However, their actions were motivated by cultural obligations that they apparently considered more binding than military discipline. The result has been a breakdown of order among the Apache Scouts that threatens the effectiveness of our entire operation. Military authorities faced a dilemma that reflected broader tensions in their relationship with Apache personnel. Punishing the Kid and his associates for following traditional Apache customs would alienate other scouts whose loyalty was essential for ongoing military operations. However, allowing Apache scouts to settle personal disputes through violence would undermine military authority and potentially lead to chaos within the scouting program. The decision was made to arrest the Kid and 4 other Apache scouts involved in the killings, with the intention of trying them in territorial court for murder. This decision represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust that had developed between the Kid and his military superiors, transforming him instantly from valued asset to criminal suspect. The arrest took place on May 27, 1887, at San Carlos Reservation, where the Kid and his associates had returned after the confrontation. Captain Pierce, accompanied by a detachment of soldiers, approached the scouts' quarters with the intention of taking them into custody without violence. However, the Apache men apparently recognized the impossibility of receiving fair treatment in territorial courts, where Apache testimony was often disregarded and where anti-Apache sentiment among white juries made conviction virtually certain regardless of the evidence. What happened next became the subject of conflicting accounts that have never been fully reconciled. According to the official military report, the Apache scouts resisted arrest and attempted to flee, forcing the soldiers to pursue them into the desert. However, alternative accounts from Apache witnesses suggested that the arrest was conducted in a manner that violated previous agreements about how scout personnel would be treated in case of disciplinary problems. Regardless of the specific details, the result was clear. The Apache Kid and his associates escaped into the desert, initiating a manhunt that would continue for years and transform the former scout into one of the most notorious outlaws in territorial history. From that moment in May 1887, the Kid ceased to exist as a person and began his transformation into a legend that would haunt the Arizona desert for decades. The immediate aftermath of the escape revealed the extent to which the Kid's military service had prepared him for life as a fugitive. His intimate knowledge of desert terrain, his understanding of military tactics and procedures, and his network of contacts throughout Apache communities gave him advantages that few outlaws could match. Moreover, his years of tracking hostile Apache bands had taught him exactly how to avoid capture by the very forces that now pursued him. Military pursuit began almost immediately, with multiple detachments dispatched to search areas where the fugitive scouts might seek shelter or support. However, these efforts quickly revealed the hopelessness of traditional military approaches to capturing men who understood Army methods as well as any officer and who possessed superior knowledge of the terrain where the pursuit would unfold. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, who had worked closely with the Kid during several military campaigns, was placed in charge of the pursuit operation. Gatewood's personal journal, preserved in military archives, reveals his recognition of the unique challenges posed by hunting his former scout. Pursuing the Apache Kid is like hunting a ghost, who knows every move we will make before we make it. He has observed our methods for years, understands our capabilities and limitations, and possesses every advantage that superior knowledge of terrain and weather can provide. Gatewood's journal continues with observations that proved accurate. The Kid is not simply another outlaw fleeing justice. He is a military professional who has been forced into opposition against his former allies. His knowledge of our procedures, combined with his exceptional individual capabilities, makes him potentially more dangerous than entire bands of hostile Apache warriors. The pursuit that followed would continue sporadically for more than a decade, generating hundreds of reports, dozens of expeditions, and countless rumors of sightings that were never confirmed. The Kid had effectively vanished into the desert landscape that he knew more intimately than perhaps any living person, emerging only to strike at targets that seemed to reflect a systematic campaign of vengeance against those he blamed for his transformation from soldier to outlaw. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Apache Kid occurred in September 1887, just 4 months after his escape from custody. A mail wagon traveling between Fort Grant and Wilcox was ambushed in Steins Pass, resulting in the death of the driver and the theft of mail, money, and supplies. The attack bore all the hallmarks of the Kid's military training: precise timing, superior positioning, and efficient execution that minimized risk while maximizing impact. What made the attack particularly significant was the presence of Apache arrows and other evidence that seemed deliberately placed to confirm the identity of the attacker. Unlike typical Apache raids, which were usually conducted by multiple warriors and focused on acquiring specific resources, this ambush appeared designed as much to send a message as to obtain material benefits. The Kid was announcing his transformation from protector to predator, using his military skills against the civilization he had once served. Military investigation of the ambush revealed tactical sophistication that confirmed official fears about the Kid's potential for sustained guerrilla warfare. Captain John Bork, who examined the attack site, reported, "The positioning and execution of this ambush demonstrate advanced understanding of military tactics combined with intimate knowledge of local terrain and travel patterns. The perpetrator anticipated the route, timing, and defensive capabilities of the target with precision that suggests extensive planning and reconnaissance." Bork's report continued with observations that would prove prophetic. This attack represents a new category of threat that combines Apache guerrilla capabilities with military training and personal motivation for revenge. Traditional approaches to dealing with Apache hostiles may prove inadequate for addressing this unique challenge. The pattern established with the Steins Pass ambush continued over the following months and years, with attacks occurring throughout southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. Each incident bore the Kid's distinctive signature: precision, efficiency, and evidence left behind to confirm his identity. However, the attacks also revealed a systematic targeting of individuals and institutions associated with his arrest and pursuit, suggesting that the Kid was conducting a personal war rather than random acts of banditry. Among the most significant targets were Apache scouts who had remained loyal to the military, reservation officials who had cooperated with his arrest, and civilian authorities who had participated in the legal proceedings against him. This targeting pattern indicated that the Kid's motivations extended beyond simple survival or material gain to include systematic revenge against those he held responsible for his exile from both Apache society and American civilization. The psychological impact of these attacks on military and civilian personnel throughout the territory was profound. The Kid's former colleagues understood his capabilities better than anyone, and their knowledge of what he could accomplish as an adversary created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear that affected operations throughout the region. Military units that had previously operated with confidence in Apache territory now moved with constant awareness that their former ally might be watching from any ridge or canyon, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Civilian authorities faced similar psychological pressures, recognizing that the Kid's knowledge of their procedures and personnel made them vulnerable to attacks that could come at any time and from any direction. The fact that he had served as a trusted ally made his transformation into an enemy, particularly unsettling, challenging assumptions about loyalty, identity, and the possibility of predicting human behavior in extreme circumstances. Contemporary newspaper accounts reveal the extent to which the Apache Kid had captured public imagination throughout the territory and beyond. The Tucson Citizen published regular updates on reported sightings and alleged attacks, while papers in California, Texas, and even eastern cities picked up stories about the renegade scout who had turned his military training against his former allies. A typical account from the Arizona Daily Star, published in March 1888, captures the mixture of fear and fascination that surrounded the Kid's legend. The Apache Kid has become a ghost that haunts our territory, appearing only to strike and then vanishing back into the desert that shelters him better than any fortress. His knowledge of military methods makes him more dangerous than any Apache warrior we have previously encountered, while his personal grievances against civilized society fuel a campaign of vengeance that shows no signs of ending. The newspaper coverage also contributed to the growth of the Kid's legend by embellishing actual incidents and reporting unconfirmed sightings as established facts. Stories about his supernatural abilities, his immunity to bullets, and his ability to appear and disappear at will transformed a flesh-and-blood outlaw into a mythical figure who embodied both Apache spiritual power and the violence of the frontier environment. This mythologizing process was encouraged by the genuine difficulty that military and civilian authorities experienced in tracking and capturing the kid. His continued freedom despite extensive manhunts seemed to confirm claims about his supernatural abilities, while the sophistication of his attacks demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of ordinary outlaws. The combination of real skill and mythical reputation created a legend that took on a life of its own, independent of the actual man who had inspired it. The kid's ability to evade capture was enhanced by a network of support that existed within Apache communities throughout the region. While official reservation policy prohibited assistance to renegades, many Apache civilians sympathized with the kid's situation and provided covert support that enabled him to remain at large. This support network reflected broader Apache resentment of military authority and reservation policies, making the kid a symbol of resistance for people who had been forced to surrender their traditional freedom. Evidence of this support network appears in military reports and correspondence that documented suspicious activities among reservation Apache populations. Colonel Wade, commanding officer at San Carlos, reported in July 1888, "There are clear indications that reservation Apache civilians are providing assistance to the Apache Kid and his associates, though the extent and nature of this support cannot be precisely determined." Efforts to investigate these activities have been frustrated by the reluctance of Apache informants to provide information about renegade activities. Wade's report continued with observations that revealed the complexity of the situation. The Apache Kid represents more than an individual outlaw to reservation populations. His resistance to capture and his ability to strike at military targets have made him a folk hero among people who feel powerless against government authority. This symbolic status makes him more dangerous than his individual capabilities alone would suggest, as it provides him with intelligence, supplies, and sanctuary that would not be available to ordinary criminals. The support network also extended beyond Apache communities to include Mexican and Mexican-American populations in border regions where the Kid frequently operated. Anti-American sentiment in these communities, combined with traditional sympathy for Apache resistance, created additional sources of support that further complicated efforts to capture the fugitive scout. Mexican authorities faced particular challenges in dealing with the Kid's activities along the international border. His attacks on American targets were often viewed favorably by Mexican citizens who resented American encroachment in the borderlands, while his Apache identity connected him to indigenous populations that existed on both sides of the artificial political boundary. These factors combined to create a situation where Mexican cooperation with American pursuit efforts was minimal and often counterproductive. The international dimensions of the Kid's activities became more significant as his raids extended deeper into Mexico and as he apparently established bases of operation in remote areas of Sonora and Chihuahua. These Mexican refugees provided sanctuary that was beyond the reach of American military forces and offered access to supplies, information, and support that enhanced his ability to continue his campaign against American targets. American military authorities attempted to address this problem through diplomatic channels, requesting Mexican cooperation in capturing or eliminating the Apache Kid and his associates. However, these efforts were complicated by broader tensions in U.S.-Mexico relations and by the practical difficulties of coordinating law enforcement activities across a border that remained poorly defined and largely uncontrolled. The Kid's activities in Mexico also brought him into contact with other outlaw groups and renegade bands that operated in the borderlands. Evidence suggests that he formed temporary alliances with Mexican bandits, Apache renegades, and even American outlaws who shared his hostility toward established authority. These alliances provided additional resources and capabilities, while making him an even more elusive target for pursuit forces. By 1890, the Apache Kid had become the most wanted fugitive in the southwestern United States, with rewards totaling several $1,000s offered by territorial, federal, and private sources for his capture, dead or alive. The size of these rewards reflected both the extent of his alleged crimes and the frustration of authorities who had been unable to apprehend him despite years of intensive effort. The reward system created a network of bounty hunters, professional trackers, and amateur manhunters who scoured the desert in search of the fugitive Apache. However, these individual efforts were generally unsuccessful and sometimes counterproductive, as inexperienced hunters often created false trails or compromised more systematic pursuit efforts by military and professional law enforcement personnel. One of the most significant attempts to capture the kid was organized in 1891 by a consortium of territorial authorities, military officials, and private interests who pooled resources to fund a comprehensive manhunt led by experienced trackers and frontier scouts. The expedition, led by former Army Scout Al Sieber, represented the most systematic effort yet undertaken to locate and capture the elusive outlaw. Sieber, who had worked with the kid during his military service and understood his capabilities better than perhaps any other white man, organized the pursuit with careful attention to the unique challenges posed by hunting such an experienced and knowledgeable quarry. The expedition included both white and Apache trackers, was equipped with the latest weapons and communication equipment, and was authorized to operate across territorial and international boundaries in pursuit of its target. The expedition tracked the kid and his associates for several weeks through some of the most challenging terrain in the Southwest, following a trail that led through Arizona, New Mexico, and into Mexico. Sieber's reports, preserved in territorial archives, reveal both the difficulty of the pursuit and the respect that the former scout had developed for his quarry's abilities. "The Apache Kid moves through this country like a ghost," Sieber wrote in a dispatch to territorial authorities. "He leaves no more sign than necessary, takes advantage of every natural feature for concealment, and anticipates our movements with an accuracy that suggests he understands our methods as well as we do ourselves. Pursuing him requires constant vigilance and perfect execution, with no margin for error or complacency." The expedition ultimately failed to capture the kid, though it did succeed in disrupting his operations and forcing him to abandon several established camps and supply caches. More importantly, the pursuit revealed the extent to which the kid had adapted to life as a fugitive, developing survival skills and defensive strategies that made him nearly impossible to surprise or corner. Sieber's final report on the expedition provided insights that influenced subsequent efforts to deal with the Apache Kid problem. This individual represents a unique challenge that cannot be addressed through conventional military or law enforcement methods. His combination of Apache skills, military training, and personal motivation creates capabilities that exceed those of ordinary outlaws, or even typical Apache renegades. Successfully dealing with him will require innovative approaches that take into account his exceptional abilities and circumstances. Following the failure of the Sieber expedition, official efforts to capture the Apache Kid became more sporadic and less coordinated. Military authorities gradually shifted their focus to other priorities, while civilian law enforcement agencies lacked the resources and expertise necessary for sustained operations in the remote desert regions where the Kid operated. This reduction in official pursuit pressure allowed the Kid to expand his activities and establish more permanent bases of operation in remote areas of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico. Evidence suggests that during this period he was able to recruit additional followers, including other Apache renegades, Mexican bandits, and disaffected individuals who were attracted by his reputation and his apparent success in defying established authority. The growth of the Kid's band created new challenges for territorial authorities while making him an even more significant threat to civilian and military targets throughout the region. Attacks attributed to his group became more frequent and more ambitious, targeting not just isolated travelers and small settlements, but also military installations and larger communities that had previously been considered secure. One of the most significant attacks occurred in 1893, when a group of raiders believed to include the Apache Kid attacked a mining camp near Clifton, Arizona, killing several miners and making off with substantial amounts of gold and supplies. The attack demonstrated tactical sophistication and advanced intelligence that suggested careful planning and reconnaissance, while the efficiency of its execution indicated the kind of military professionalism that had characterized the Kid's service as an Army scout. Investigation of the Clifton attack revealed evidence that the raiders had established temporary camps in the surrounding mountains and had conducted surveillance of the target for several days before striking. This level of preparation, combined with their ability to approach and withdraw without detection, demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of ordinary bandit groups and confirmed official fears about the Kid's evolution into a major regional threat. The Clifton attack also marked a shift in the nature of the Kid's activities, from personal revenge against individuals associated with his arrest to broader predatory activities that threatened the economic development of the entire region. Mining operations, ranch settlements, and transportation routes all became potential targets for an outlaw band that possessed both the motivation and the capability to conduct systematic raids against civilian targets. This escalation prompted renewed official attention to the Apache Kid problem, with territorial authorities requesting federal assistance for a comprehensive campaign to eliminate the threat he represented. However, these requests were complicated by the ongoing economic depression of the 1890s and by competing demands for federal resources throughout the Western territories. Federal response to the Apache Kid situation was further complicated by questions about jurisdiction and legal authority. The Kid's activities crossed territorial and international boundaries, involved both military and civilian targets, and required coordination between multiple agencies and governmental levels that had limited experience with such complex law enforcement challenges. Military authorities argued that the Kid's background as a former scout and his apparent military organization made him primarily a military target that should be addressed through army operations. Civilian law enforcement agencies maintained that his crimes against civilian targets made him a civil matter that should be handled through normal judicial processes. Mexican authorities were reluctant to cooperate in activities that might legitimize American military operations on Mexican territory. These jurisdictional disputes delayed effective action while allowing the Kid to continue his activities with minimal interference from official pursuit efforts. His ability to exploit these institutional weaknesses demonstrated strategic thinking that reflected his military training and his understanding of the political and legal systems that governed law enforcement in the borderlands. By the mid-1890s, the Apache Kid had achieved a legendary status that transcended his actual activities and accomplishments. Newspaper stories, dime novels, and popular accounts had transformed him from an individual outlaw into a symbol of Apache resistance and frontier violence that captured public imagination throughout the United States and beyond. This legendary status was enhanced by the genuine mystery that surrounded his activities and whereabouts. Confirmed sightings were rare and often contradictory, while alleged attacks attributed to him occurred across such a wide geographic area that it seemed impossible for a single individual to be responsible for all of them. The result was a legend that existed independently of the actual man, incorporating both factual incidents and mythical elements that reflected popular fascination with outlaw figures and Apache culture. The mythologizing process was encouraged by the Kid's continued success in avoiding capture, despite rewards, manhunts, and public attention that would have led to the apprehension of most fugitives. His apparent invincibility created an aura of supernatural protection that resonated with both Apache spiritual traditions and popular beliefs about the power of the desert to shelter those who understood its secrets. Contemporary accounts reveal the extent to which the Apache Kid had become a figure of popular culture, as well as a law enforcement problem. Magazine articles, newspaper features, and book-length treatments presented various versions of his story, often embellishing actual events and incorporating fictional elements that enhanced the dramatic appeal of the narrative. A typical example appears in Harper's Weekly for October 1894, which published a lengthy article titled "The Apache Kid, Ghost of the Desert." The article, written by a correspondent who claimed to have interviewed witnesses to several attacks, presents the Kid as a figure of almost supernatural capabilities, who embodies both the romance and the terror of the frontier experience. The Apache Kid has become more than an outlaw, the Harper's article states. He represents the unconquerable spirit of the desert itself, the refusal of the wilderness to submit completely to the advance of civilization. His continued freedom serves as a reminder that there remain forces in the American West that cannot be tamed through conventional means, that some aspects of the frontier experience will always exist beyond the reach of law and order. This romanticization of the Kid's activities reflected broader cultural attitudes toward outlaw figures and Apache culture that were common during the 1890s. As the frontier era drew to a close and the Apache Wars concluded with the surrender of Geronimo in 1886, popular culture began to mythologize both outlaws and Native Americans as symbols of a vanishing way of life that represented freedom and authenticity, in contrast to the increasing organization and regulation of American society. The Apache Kid story perfectly embodied these cultural themes, combining outlaw romance with Apache mysticism and frontier violence in ways that appealed to audiences seeking escape from the routine of increasingly urbanized and industrialized American life. His transformation from loyal scout to renegade outlaw provided a narrative arc that resonated with popular concerns about loyalty, betrayal, and the costs of cultural assimilation. However, the mythologizing of the Apache Kid also obscured the genuine suffering and social disruption that his activities had created. Families of his victims, communities that lived in fear of attack, and individuals whose livelihoods were threatened by his raids experienced the real consequences of his transformation from protector to predator. Military and civilian authorities continued their efforts to locate and capture the Kid throughout the 1890s, though these efforts became increasingly sporadic and less well-funded as other priorities claimed official attention. The end of the Apache Wars with Geronimo's surrender had reduced public interest in Apache-related issues, while economic depression and political changes diverted resources away from law enforcement activities in remote frontier regions. Nevertheless, reports of Apache Kid sightings and alleged attacks continued to surface regularly throughout the decade, maintaining public awareness of his continued freedom while frustrating officials who had been unable to resolve what had become an embarrassing symbol of governmental ineffectiveness in law enforcement matters. The most credible late sighting of the Apache Kid occurred in 1896, when a group of Mexican ranchers reported encountering a band of Apache raiders led by an individual who matched the Kid's description. The encounter occurred in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Sonora, where the band was allegedly rustling cattle and raiding isolated settlements. According to the Mexican witnesses, the Apache leader spoke fluent English and Spanish, demonstrated detailed knowledge of American military procedures, and possessed the kind of natural authority that suggested extensive leadership experience. These characteristics, combined with physical descriptions that matched known information about the Kid, led Mexican authorities to conclude that they had encountered the notorious fugitive. However, efforts to pursue the band into the Sierra Madre proved unsuccessful, as the raiders vanished into terrain that was familiar to them but unknown to their pursuers. The incident reinforced the impression that the Kid had established secure bases of operation in remote areas of Mexico that provided sanctuary from both American and Mexican law enforcement efforts. This 1896 sighting represented the last credible report of Apache Kid activities that could be verified through official sources. Subsequent alleged sightings became increasingly unreliable and contradictory, while confirmed criminal activities that might have been attributed to his band became rare and eventually ceased altogether. The gradual disappearance of credible Apache Kid sightings after 1896 led to speculation about his ultimate fate that continues to the present day. Some observers concluded that he had finally been killed, either in conflict with law enforcement forces or through private vengeance, while others suggested that he had chosen to retire from outlaw activities and live quietly under an assumed identity. Alternative theories propose that the Kid had returned to Mexico permanently, either continuing his outlaw career in areas where American authorities could not pursue him or settling into peaceful obscurity in some remote community that offered sanctuary from his turbulent past. The absence of confirmed information about his fate allowed each of these theories to maintain credibility among different audiences interested in solving the mystery of his disappearance. The Apache Kid's legend continued to grow even as reliable information about his activities became scarce. Popular culture treatments of his story proliferated during the early 20th century, with each new version adding elements that enhanced the dramatic appeal of the narrative while moving further away from documented historical facts. These popular culture adaptations reflected changing attitudes toward both outlaws and Native Americans as American society moved further away from its frontier origins. The Kid was increasingly portrayed as a tragic figure whose transformation from loyal scout to renegade outlaw symbolized the impossible situation faced by Native Americans caught between conflicting cultures and value systems. This sympathetic interpretation of the Kid's story represented a significant shift from earlier accounts that had emphasized his threat to civilized society and his betrayal of American trust. By the 1920s and 1930s, popular culture was more likely to present him as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, rather than as a villainous figure who had chosen evil over good. Academic historians began serious study of the Apache Kid case during the mid-20th century, as access to previously classified military records and the development of more sophisticated analytical methods made possible more objective assessment of his activities and their historical significance. These scholarly treatments attempted to separate factual information from mythical elements while placing the Kid's story within broader contexts of Apache history and frontier development. Modern historical analysis has confirmed many elements of the traditional Apache Kid narrative, while questioning others that appear to have been embellished or fabricated by contemporary sources seeking to enhance the dramatic appeal of their accounts. The basic outline of his transformation from Army Scout to outlaw appears to be well documented, as are the general characteristics of his subsequent activities and his success in avoiding capture. However, many specific incidents attributed to the Kid cannot be verified through reliable sources, while the extent of his criminal activities and the number of his victims remain subjects of scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the Kid's actual impact was much less significant than his legendary status would suggest, while others maintain that his activities represented a major challenge to law and order in the late 19th century Southwest. Contemporary law enforcement analysis of the Apache Kid case has focused on the unique challenges posed by pursuing an adversary who possessed intimate knowledge of the methods and procedures used against him. His military training and experience as a scout provided him with advantages that few criminals have ever possessed, while his cultural background gave him access to survival skills and support networks that enhanced his ability to remain at large. Modern criminal justice professionals have studied the Kid's case as an example of how institutional knowledge can be weaponized against the institutions that originally provided it. His transformation from trusted ally to dangerous adversary illustrated vulnerabilities in military and law enforcement systems that remain relevant to contemporary security concerns. The Apache Kid story has also attracted attention from scholars interested in questions of identity, loyalty, and cultural conflict in frontier societies. His position as a man caught between conflicting cultural systems and value frameworks provides insights into the psychological and social pressures faced by individuals who attempted to bridge the gap between Native American and Anglo-American societies during the late 19th century. Anthropological analysis of the Kid's case has emphasized the impossible nature of his situation as an Apache man serving American military interests against his own people. The cultural contradictions inherent in this position created psychological pressures that few individuals could sustain indefinitely, making his eventual break with military authority almost inevitable regardless of the specific circumstances that triggered it. Modern Apache communities have developed complex attitudes toward the Apache Kid that reflect both pride in his resistance to oppression and concern about the violence associated with his activities. Some contemporary Apache leaders view him as a hero who chose to fight rather than submit to unjust authority, while others argue that his actions brought additional suffering to Apache people who were already facing overwhelming challenges. These differing perspectives reflect broader debates within Native American communities about the appropriate responses to historical and contemporary oppression. The Apache Kid story provides a case study in the moral complexities faced by individuals who choose violent resistance over peaceful accommodation, raising questions about the effectiveness and justification of different approaches to addressing injustice. Archaeological investigations at sites associated with Apache Kid activities have provided additional insights into his methods and movements during his years as a fugitive. Remote campsites, supply caches, and defensive positions have been identified and studied using modern archaeological techniques that were not available to his contemporary pursuers. These investigations have confirmed the sophistication of the kid's survival strategies and his intimate knowledge of the terrain where he operated. Evidence from archaeological sites supports accounts of his ability to live off the land for extended periods while maintaining the mobility necessary to avoid capture and conduct raids against selected targets. The archaeological evidence also reveals the extent to which the kid was able to adapt traditional Apache survival techniques to the unique challenges of life as a hunted fugitive. Analysis of recovered artifacts shows sophisticated understanding of resource management, defensive positioning, and mobility strategies that enabled him to survive in harsh desert environments while maintaining the capability to conduct offensive operations against his enemies. Modern forensic analysis of sites associated with Apache Kid activities has also provided new insights into the scale and nature of his operations during his outlaw years. Evidence from multiple locations suggests that his band included not only Apache followers, but also Mexican bandits, American deserters, and other fugitives who were attracted by his reputation and his apparent success in defying established authority. This diverse composition of the kid's band created both strengths and vulnerabilities that influenced his long-term survival and effectiveness. The varied skills and backgrounds of his followers provided capabilities that a purely Apache group might have lacked, including knowledge of different languages, cultures, and geographical areas that enhanced their ability to operate across the complex political and cultural landscape of the borderlands. However, the diversity of his followers also created internal tensions and security risks that made the group more vulnerable to betrayal and infiltration by law enforcement agents. The different motivations and loyalties of band members meant that maintaining group cohesion required constant attention and management that diverted energy from operational activities. Psychological analysis of the Apache Kid's transformation from loyal scout to renegade outlaw has identified patterns that remain relevant to contemporary understanding of how trusted individuals can become security threats. His case illustrates the dangerous potential of institutional insiders who possess detailed knowledge of organizational procedures, capabilities, and vulnerabilities. The kid's military service had provided him with intimate knowledge of Army tactics, communication systems, supply procedures, and personnel characteristics that proved invaluable during his outlaw career. This knowledge allowed him to anticipate military responses to his activities, exploit weaknesses in pursuit operations, and strike at targets with precision that reflected detailed understanding of their defensive capabilities. Modern security professionals have studied the Apache Kid case as an early example of the insider threat phenomenon that has become increasingly important in contemporary security planning. His story demonstrates how trusted personnel can become adversaries who pose unique dangers because of their institutional knowledge and access to sensitive information. The psychological factors that contributed to the kid's transformation have also been analyzed in the context of contemporary understanding of trauma, identity conflict, and moral injury. His experience of being forced to hunt and kill members of his own people while serving as an Army scout created psychological pressures that modern analysis recognizes as potentially devastating to individual mental health and moral stability. The concept of moral injury, developed through study of contemporary military veterans, provides a framework for understanding the psychological damage that the kid may have suffered during his years of military service. Being required to betray fundamental aspects of his cultural identity and personal relationships created wounds that may have made his eventual break with military authority inevitable, regardless of the specific trigger event. Contemporary mental health professionals who have studied the kid's case suggest that his transformation reflected not moral weakness or inherent criminality, but rather the predictable psychological consequences of impossible role conflicts that exceeded any individual's capacity for adaptation. This perspective reframes his story from a tale of good versus evil to a tragedy of institutional failure and human limitation. The Apache Kid's legend has continued to influence popular culture throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, inspiring numerous books, films, television programs, and other media adaptations that have kept his story alive in American popular consciousness. These adaptations have generally moved further away from documented historical facts, while emphasizing themes of individual freedom, resistance to authority, and the tragedy of cultural conflict. Modern popular culture treatments of the Kid's story often present him as a sympathetic figure, whose violence was justified by the injustices he suffered, rather than as a criminal whose actions threatened innocent people. This romanticized interpretation reflects contemporary attitudes toward both Native American history and outlaw figures that differ significantly from the perspectives of his contemporaries. The persistence of popular interest in the Apache Kid reflects broader cultural fascination with figures who represent individual freedom and resistance to institutional authority. His story provides a narrative framework for exploring themes of loyalty, betrayal, identity, and moral choice that remain relevant to contemporary audiences despite the historical distance from the frontier era. Academic conferences, historical societies, and research institutions continue to organize programs and publications focused on Apache Kid studies, reflecting ongoing scholarly interest in his case and its broader historical significance. These academic treatments attempt to maintain balance between popular fascination with the Kid's legend and rigorous historical analysis of documented evidence about his activities and their impacts. Recent scholarly work has emphasized the importance of understanding the Apache Kid within broader contexts of late 19th century American Indian policy, military strategy, and cultural transformation in the Southwest. His story illustrates the human consequences of policies that forced Native Americans to choose between cultural survival and individual accommodation to dominant society demands. The Kid's case has also been analyzed as an example of how government policies created the very problems they were designed to solve. By recruiting Apache men as scouts against their own people, military authorities created psychological and social tensions that inevitably produced the kind of resistance that the Kid came to represent. Modern Apache tribal governments and cultural organizations have developed educational programs that use the Apache Kid story to illustrate the historical challenges faced by Native American communities and the continuing importance of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances. These programs attempt to extract positive lessons from a tragic story while avoiding glorification of violence or lawlessness. Contemporary discussions of the Apache Kid within Apache communities often emphasize the impossible choices he faced and the broader social forces that shaped his destiny. Rather than focusing on his individual actions, these discussions examine the systemic problems that created conditions where such transformations became inevitable for some individuals caught between conflicting worlds. The ongoing mystery of the Apache Kid's ultimate fate continues to attract amateur historians, genealogy researchers, and treasure hunters who search for evidence that might resolve questions about how and when he died. These investigations occasionally produce claims of new discoveries or revelations, though none have yet provided conclusive evidence about his final years. DNA analysis and other modern forensic techniques offer potential methods for resolving some questions about Apache Kid-related discoveries, though the lack of authenticated physical remains or artifacts directly connected to him limits the applicability of these technologies. Future archaeological discoveries might provide new evidence, but the vast and remote terrain where he operated makes such finds unlikely. The legend of the Apache Kid has also influenced tourism and economic development in regions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico, where he was active. Tourist attractions, historical markers, and promotional materials often reference his story as part of the area's frontier heritage, though these commercial adaptations typically emphasize romantic aspects of his legend rather than the violence and suffering associated with his activities. Local historical societies and museums have developed exhibits and programs that attempt to present balanced accounts of the Apache Kid story, while acknowledging both its historical significance and its continuing cultural impact. These presentations face the challenge of satisfying public interest in dramatic narratives, while maintaining historical accuracy and sensitivity to the victims of the violence associated with his transformation. Contemporary law enforcement agencies in the Southwest occasionally encounter individuals who claim to be descendants of the Apache Kid, or who assert knowledge of his ultimate fate. These claims are generally investigated as potential sources of historical information, though none have yet provided verifiable evidence that resolves the mystery of his disappearance. The Apache Kid story has also influenced contemporary discussions of criminal justice, military policy, and cultural relations in ways that extend beyond historical interest. His case is sometimes cited in debates about the treatment of military veterans, the integration of cultural minorities into dominant institutions, and the long-term consequences of policies that create identity conflicts for individuals caught between competing loyalties. Modern military and law enforcement agencies study the Apache Kid case as part of training programs focused on understanding and preventing insider threats. His transformation from trusted ally to dangerous adversary provides a historical example of how institutional knowledge can be weaponized against the organizations that originally provided it, making his story relevant to contemporary security concerns. The psychological aspects of the Kid's story have also influenced modern approaches to military mental health, veteran affairs, and the treatment of individuals who have experienced moral injury in the course of institutional service. His case illustrates the importance of recognizing and addressing the psychological consequences of role conflicts that exceed individual capacity for adaptation. International human rights organizations have occasionally referenced the Apache Kid story in discussions of indigenous rights, cultural preservation, and the responsibilities of governments toward minority populations. His transformation from collaborator to resistance fighter exemplifies patterns of indigenous response to colonization that have occurred in many different contexts throughout world history. The Apache Kid's legend continues to evolve as new generations discover his story and interpret it through contemporary cultural perspectives. Social media, internet forums, and digital publications have created new venues for discussing his legacy and debating questions about his historical significance and moral status. These contemporary discussions often reflect current social and political concerns projected onto historical figures, making the Apache Kid a vehicle for exploring modern issues of justice, resistance, identity, and moral choice. While these interpretations may not accurately reflect historical realities, they demonstrate the continuing relevance of his story to audiences seeking to understand the relationship between individual action and social forces. Educational institutions continue to use the Apache Kid story as a case study in courses related to American history, Native American studies, military history, and criminal justice. His transformation from scout to outlaw provides a complex narrative that illustrates multiple aspects of late 19th century American society and the challenges faced by individuals caught between competing cultural systems. The pedagogical value of the Kid's story lies not in providing simple moral lessons, but in demonstrating the complexity of historical processes and the human consequences of policy decisions that create impossible situations for affected individuals. Students who study his case gain insights into the interconnections between personal choice and social structure that remain relevant to contemporary social analysis. Research into Apache Kid-related topics continues to produce new publications, academic papers, and scholarly conferences that explore different aspects of his story and its broader historical context. This ongoing research reflects both the intrinsic interest of his case and its value as a window into larger patterns of cultural conflict and adaptation in American frontier history. Future research directions include more sophisticated analysis of existing documentary sources, expanded archaeological investigation of sites associated with his activities, and comparative analysis of his story with similar cases of cultural mediators who became resistance figures in other historical contexts. The Apache Kid's transformation from soldier to outlaw to legend represents one of the most compelling and complex narratives in American frontier history. His story encompasses themes of loyalty and betrayal, cultural conflict and individual choice, justice and vengeance that continue to resonate with contemporary audiences seeking to understand the human dimensions of historical processes. Whether viewed as a hero who chose resistance over submission, a tragic figure destroyed by impossible circumstances, or a criminal who betrayed the trust placed in him, the Apache Kid embodies the contradictions and complexities of the American frontier experience. His legend serves as a reminder that history is made by individuals whose choices, however constrained by circumstances, shape the course of events in ways that continue to influence subsequent generations. The mystery of his ultimate fate ensures that the Apache Kid will remain a figure of fascination and debate, a ghost of the desert whose story will continue to haunt the American imagination, as long as people are drawn to tales of freedom and resistance, tragedy and transformation. In the end, perhaps it is fitting that a man who spent his final years as a shadow moving through the vast landscapes of the Southwest should remain forever elusive, his true story buried somewhere in the desert dust that witnessed his transformation from protector to predator, from man to myth. The Apache Kid's legacy reminds us that the American frontier was not simply a stage for heroic conquest or romantic adventure, but a crucible where cultures collided and individual destinies were forged in the fire of impossible choices. His story stands as a testament to the human capacity for both loyalty and betrayal, for both creation and destruction, and for the terrible price that individuals sometimes pay when they are caught between worlds that offer no path forward except through violence. Today, as we drive the highways that cross the desert landscapes where the Apache Kid once rode, we pass through country that still holds secrets buried in its rocky arroyos and wind-carved mesas. The ghost of the desert may be gone, but the questions his story raises about loyalty, identity, and the cost of survival in a hostile world remain as relevant today as they were in the harsh sunlight of the 1880s Arizona Territory, where a young Apache scout named the Kid learned that sometimes the greatest enemies are those we once called friends, and that the longest journeys are not across the desert, but from the man we were to the legend we become.